My grandpa was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. His presence was enough, steady, grounded, and unshakable. When he passed away, it felt like the foundation beneath me gave way. To cope, I made a habit of visiting his grave, finding a strange kind of solace in the silence there. It became my quiet ritual, my way of keeping him close. The cemetery where he was buried was old, almost timeless, with ancient oak trees that loomed overhead like watchful guardians. The headstones, weathered and leaning, seemed caught mid-bough, frozen in reverence to the years that had passed them by. Narrow, winding paths snaked through the graves like they were purposefully leading you through the stories of those resting there. It wasn't eerie. It was serene. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I visited often, always bringing flowers, bright bursts of life against the muted gray of stone. I like to think it brought a touch of color to an otherwise somber place. That evening, just before sunset, I decided to go again. The sky was painted in soft oranges and purples, the sun a sinking ember casting jagged shadows across the uneven ground. A cool breeze stirred the leaves above me, their rustling the only sound as I walked. Even the birds had gone silent. When I reached Grandpa's grave, I lingered, staring at the simple headstone that bore his name. It was just like him, unpretentious, straightforward, and quietly dignified. I knelt to place the flowers at its base, whispering a few words, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. Him? Myself? The air around me seemed to chill as the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the ground. I brushed off the creeping cold as the evening settling in. After a few more moments, I turned and made my way back to the car. The gravel crunched under my feet, each step pulling me further from the comforting presence of his grave. Just as I reached the gates, my phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. My heart jolted as I fumbled for it. The number was unfamiliar, but curiosity, or maybe instinct, compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice hesitant, barely above a whisper. At first, there was nothing, just an eerie static, faint and uneven, like the line itself was struggling to stay connected. Then, a voice cut through, a voice I knew as well as my own. It was Grandpa. "Why did you leave so soon?" The words were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably his. My breath caught, my chest tightening as though the air itself had turned solid. I knew it couldn't be him. It was impossible. But the voice on the other end was so real, so familiar, it made my knees weak. Who is this?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The line went dead, just like that. No explanation, no static, just silence. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, my phone still clutched in my hand. My mind raced, grasping for logic, but nothing made sense. It had to be a cruel joke, a prank. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That night, his voice haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, clear as day. The next morning, I woke with a single thought. I had to go back. I needed to prove to myself that it was just my imagination, that grief was playing tricks on me. The cemetery looked the same as it always did. The trees, the graves, the well-worn paths winding like veins through the earth. But something about it felt off. The air was heavier, thick with an unease that I couldn't explain. As I neared Grandpa's grave, my heart began to race, and then I saw it. Him. He was standing a few feet from his headstone, just as I remembered him. His familiar clothes, his hands folded neatly in front of him, the faintest hint of a smile on his face. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of comfort, but that feeling didn't last. His eyes met mine, and something in them was wrong. They were too sharp, too piercing, like they were looking through me instead of at me. The longer I stared, the more I realized this wasn't my grandpa. And then his face began to change. Slowly, his skin drained of color, turning an ashen gray. His eyes hollowed, his cheeks sank, and his mouth twisted into something grotesque, a grimace that seemed to mock the gentle smile I once knew. It was like I was looking at a fractured mirror version of him, a distorted reflection of the man I loved. He stepped toward me. Just one step, but it was enough to break the paralysis that had gripped me. My body finally obeyed the screams in my mind, and I turned and ran. The path blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the gate. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching down like skeletal arms trying to grab me, pull me back. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my car, I flung myself inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. I sat there, staring at the cemetery gate, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just the empty silence of the graveyard. I never went back. I couldn't. Whatever I saw that day, whatever spoke to me on the phone, it wasn't Grandpa. It was something else, something I should have never disturbed. And even now, the memory lingers like a shadow at the edge of my mind, reminding me that some things are better left alone. I never expected a job as a cemetery security guard to mess with my head the way it did. I mean, on paper it sounded simple enough. Walk the grounds, deter vandals, and keep the place quiet. Most nights, it was just me, my flashlight, and the endless rows of headstones stretching into the darkness. The silence out there was different, though. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the kind that presses into your chest and refuses to let go. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that was before he showed up. It all started about a month ago. I remember because it was one of those nights where the air feels so still. Even the crickets stay quiet. I was halfway through my rounds, my flashlight cutting small arcs through the darkness, when I spotted him. He was standing by a grave near the edge of the cemetery, one of the older ones, where time had weathered the names into illegibility. It was 3 a.m. sharp. I always checked my watch at that time, partly out of habit and partly because the witching hour makes you aware of things you'd rather ignore. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there like he'd been carved from stone. He wore dark clothes, and from where I was, he looked wrong, though I couldn't say exactly how. Something about his stillness set my teeth on edge. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound authoritative. My voice broke the silence like a gunshot, but he didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge me, just kept staring at that grave. I thought maybe he was a mourner. Grief makes people do strange things, and who was I to judge? But as I stood there watching him, a prickle of unease started crawling up my spine. There was something off about this man, something I couldn't explain, but it made my gut twist in a way I couldn't ignore. The next night, he was there again. Same time, same grave, same eerie stillness. I was starting to feel like I'd stepped into a loop, one I couldn't get out of. When I shouted at him, he stayed frozen, as if my voice couldn't reach him. By the third night, I stopped shouting altogether. I didn't want to get any closer, but I also couldn't just leave him there. I started watching him from a distance, trying to figure him out. He never moved, never looked away from that grave. It wasn't just unsettling, it was unnatural. I began to wonder if he was even real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But every time, 3 a.m. came, and there he was, a shadow against the moonlit stones. It was like he belonged to the cemetery in a way I never could. After a week, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity, or maybe my fear, reached a boiling point, and I decided to confront him. That night, I arrived early and waited behind a giant oak tree not far from his usual spot. The bark scratched against my back as I tried to steady my breathing, my heart thundering in my ears. At exactly 3 a.m., he appeared. I don't mean he walked up or stepped into view. He was just there, like he'd materialized out of thin air. My legs felt like lead as I stepped out from my hiding place and made my way toward him. The closer I got, the stranger he seemed. His clothes were ancient, tattered, and coated with what looked like years of dirt and grime. His skin wasn't just pale, it was ashen, like it had been drained of life. And his eyes, they were hollow, empty, like looking into a void. I forced the words out of my dry throat. "What are you doing here?" My voice wavered, and the flashlight in my hand felt suddenly useless. He didn't react, didn't blink. I was standing maybe 3 feet away, and it was like I wasn't even there. Summoning every ounce of courage I didn't actually have, I reached out and touched his shoulder. The moment my fingers made contact, he turned, and I'll never forget what I saw. His face, it twisted into something inhuman. His mouth stretched into this grotesque, unnatural grin that seemed to cut his face in half. His teeth were jagged, too long, and looked like they belonged to something feral. But his eyes, they were the worst. They went from empty to full of something dark, something ancient, something furious. It wasn't just anger, it was hate, pure and unfiltered, directed straight at me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in his gaze. His skin started pulling back, revealing raw, decaying flesh beneath. The smell hit me next, rot and earth and something metallic, like blood. It was overwhelming, suffocating. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. He didn't move toward me, didn't say a word. He just stood there, that awful grin carved into his face, watching me, watching through me, like he could see everything I was and everything I wasn't. I don't remember how I made it back to the cemetery gates. My legs moved on their own, and I didn't dare look back. When I finally stopped, gasping for air and clutching the gate for support, the cemetery behind me was silent and empty. The grave he'd stood by looked just like the others, undisturbed. The next day, I tried to learn more about that grave. It belonged to a man who died over 50 years ago. No family, no visitors, nothing unusual. But after that night, nothing felt ordinary to me anymore. I finished my shifts, but every night at 3 a.m., I found myself holding my breath, waiting. He never came back, but the fear did. It stayed with me, shadowing me even in daylight. I still see his face sometimes in my dreams, or maybe in my nightmares, and I can't help but wonder, what was he? A ghost? Something worse? I don't have answers, and I'm not sure I want them. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some graves, they're best left forgotten. I wasn't planning to spend my Saturday night wandering through a cemetery, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. It happened last fall, during one of those crisp October evenings, when the air smells faintly of wood smoke and the leaves crunch like popcorn underfoot. I had just moved to a small, sleepy town in Pennsylvania, chasing a job opportunity that promised stability but delivered isolation. New to the area and eager to explore, I took my camera and decided to check out a cemetery that locals mentioned was both historic and picturesque. The place wasn't far from where I lived, maybe a 15-minute drive. It was perched on a hill, with old wrought iron gates and rows of weathered tombstones leaning this way and that. I'd always had a thing for old cemeteries. They're quiet, atmospheric, and photographically rich. Plus, It gave me something to do besides sitting in my apartment and scrolling aimlessly on my phone. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the headstones, I wandered around snapping pictures. The place was eerily beautiful, with ancient oaks twisting their gnarled branches overhead. A few of the graves dated back to the 1800s, their inscriptions barely legible under layers of moss. Time had clearly done its work here. I was so engrossed in getting the perfect shot of a statue of an angel, its face worn smooth by decades of rain, that I didn't notice the sky darkening until it was almost completely black. When I glanced at my phone, I realized it was later than I thought, almost 8 p.m. The cemetery gates officially closed at dusk, but no one had come to kick me out. Still, I decided I'd better pack up and head back to my car before someone reported me for trespassing. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I caught it again. A faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across stone. It was subtle, but in the stillness of the cemetery, it stood out. I froze, my heart picking up speed. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast open space. No response. The logical part of me said it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat. But another part, the part that had watched too many horror movies, wasn't so sure. I started walking faster, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. The scraping noise stopped, which should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Then, just as I reached the gate, I heard a distinct sound behind me. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of someone jogging, but slow, deliberate ones, like someone trying to stay quiet, but not quite succeeding. I whipped around, scanning the darkness. My eyes struggled to adjust, and the shadows cast by the trees seemed to move and shift. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I quickened my pace, practically jogging to my car. When I reached the parking lot, it was empty except for my car, which was parked under a flickering streetlight. I unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the entrance to the cemetery. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I saw it. Just inside the gate, partially hidden by the shadows, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a statue because it was so still. But then it moved, stepping slightly closer to the edge of the light. It was a man, tall and wiry, dressed in what looked like old, tattered clothes. His face was partially obscured by a hat, but I could see his eyes, dark and fixed directly on me. My hands fumbled with the gear shift as I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the lot. The man didn't move, but his gaze followed me until I turned onto the main road and lost sight of the cemetery. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot. I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and tried to shake the lingering feeling of unease. I told myself it was probably just some eccentric local, or maybe even a caretaker. But deep down, I knew something about the encounter wasn't normal. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I posted about the experience in a local Facebook group, asking if anyone else had seen or experienced anything unusual at the cemetery. Most of the replies were jokes or dismissive comments, but one message stood out. It was from an older woman who claimed to have lived in the area her whole life. "Stay away from that cemetery at night," she wrote. "Years ago, there was a man who used to hang around there, scaring people off. They say he disappeared one night and was never found. Some folks think he's still out there." I wanted to brush it off as a local legend, but the description of the man matched the figure I'd seen. I haven't gone back to the cemetery since, and I don't plan to. Maybe it was all a coincidence, or maybe there's more to that place than I'll ever understand. Either way, I'll stick to daylight photography from now on. If you like these stories, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Thank you for watching.